When I was growing up, I often thought, in a back-of-the-mind, unreflective kind of way, that the entertainment I liked was created by a single person, essentially acting alone. This probably had something to do with the fact that I was a voracious reader, and books are one of the few popular art forms that actually can be made by a single person working alone. L. Frank Baum made The Wizard of Oz, C.S. Lewis made The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Roald Dahl made Matilda, and so naturally I assumed that the same was true for movies and video games, that George Lucas just made Star Wars, and Shigeru Miyamoto just made Ocarina of Time. If I didn't assume that one person was largely responsible for something, it was generally just because I hadn't heard of anyone who worked on it. I loved the Donkey Kong Country games, for example, but didn't know anything about the people at Rareware who made them, so I just credited the company itself and didn't think too much about it. This was also the case for most Nintendo games, the Batman franchise, the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. All of these were things I loved as a kid and didn't know who to thank for it, but I never really abandoned the idea that it was one person, and someday I would find out who. Even later on in my teens, I found this assumption of sole authorship remarkably hard to shake. In all the interviews I read leading up to the release of BioShock, I heard Ken Levine talk about so many different aspects of the game's design that I figured he must be the reason the game was the way it was, the central creative personality who gave the game its soul. It took a sequel with him still in charge, but several other key staff members missing to knock that notion out of my head. As I played and enjoyed Psychonauts, I assumed that Tim Schafer was the great inventor who had come up with all these brilliant ideas, even though it should have occurred to me that nobody is that endlessly inventive, and there were probably other creative people involved in making the game. So even though I was an adult when I learned that Masato Kato was the sole scenario and dialogue writer for Baten Kaitos, I still felt a little frisson at the idea that I had finally identified the man who'd made one of my favorite games. This was it. This was the guy who made Baten Kaitos so special and different from the other RPGs I'd experienced, both before and after playing it. Clearly, just like how Alfred Hitchcock put his personal stamp on Vertigo, so that despite all the other people involved, you know at a glance that it's a Hitchcock movie, Masato Kato must have been the genius architect behind Baten Kaitos' brilliant design. Except that the truth, in both cases actually, is more complicated than that. In fact, if I had looked into the facts behind the creation of Baten Kaitos back when I first played it, I probably would have abandoned my auteur obsession about a decade before I actually did. Baten Kaitos isn't as special as it is because it came from a single person's mind, but rather because it was produced by a meeting of the minds, a combination of brilliant ideas from a team whose greatest asset, as far as I can tell, was their willingness to accept and incorporate ideas from lots of different contributors. Far from being the product of a single lone wolf creator, Baten Kaitos is actually one of the best arguments in favor of teamwork and close collaboration that I've ever run across in the history of video games. Baten Kaitos had two directors. Neither one was Masato Kato, and only one even worked for Monolith Soft, which I may have misled you earlier into believing was the only studio involved in developing the game. Monolith was primarily responsible only for the game's story and art design. The mechanical nuts and bolts of the game, particularly its innovative card-based combat system, were created by an entirely different studio called Tri-Crescendo, which had only worked on sound design for other studios before, and had no experience actually making a game. The idea to have Monolith and Tri-Crescendo work together wasn't even one that either of them came up with. It was their publisher, Namco, who suggested the collaboration after receiving pitches for independent projects from both studios at around the same time. It's a testimony to the open-mindedness of both of them, and maybe also to their status as newcomers to the industry, that they agreed to this team-up and eventually formed a close partnership in which the central ideas of both pitches would feed into each other in a surprisingly synergistic way. To the extent that Masato Kato did define Baten Kaitos' identity, it was largely due to his eagerness to listen to outside ideas and willingness to change his story to suit them. For instance, when he heard that the game's combat system was going to involve magical cards, he insisted on writing that concept into the game's setting, so that Magnus would end up as something more than a gimmick confined to the battle screen and forgotten as soon as the battle was over. Instead, Magnus are essential to Baten Kaitos in terms of both story and gameplay, so much so that they frequently help to weave the story and gameplay together. Who can say if the idea of using blank Magnus to solve puzzles would have survived to the end if the scenario writer hadn't been willing to base major story events on them? In an interview with Famitsu a couple of years ago, Masato Kato mentioned that Chrono Cross was his personal favorite story to write, because it was entirely what he wanted to say, the way he wanted to say it. An auteur piece, in other words. But he also said that he thought Baten Kaitos was a better story because of its coherence. And I found this all supremely ironic, because it's absolutely true that Baten Kaitos is more coherent than Chrono Cross, even though you'd expect an auteur project, which is all just one guy's ideas faithfully executed to the letter, to be the kind of project where nothing would clash or seem out of place. But what you actually get is the opposite. Chrono Cross is all Masato Kato's ideas, and it's outlandish, all over the place in terms of tone, and just generally batshit crazy. While Baten Kaitos, which was created from two totally separate game pitches welded together and is full of unusual novel ideas, actually comes across as the more mature and focused game of the two. It's like The Empire Strikes Back, where George Lucas's ideas were tempered by the wisdom of other, more established writers, and ended up as something greater than he could have imagined. Chrono Cross is a lot more like The Phantom Menace, where George Lucas's ideas were out of control, and it seems like nobody knew how to say no to any of them. I also think Baten Kaitos is better than Chrono Cross. In fact, if I'm being honest, I think it's better than Chrono Trigger, and most other RPGs as well. To me, Baten Kaitos was, is, and always will be a gem of a game. And I don't mean that in just the cliché sense that it's really good and a rarity among its contemporaries. Baten Kaitos actually reminds me of a gem. And so in analyzing it here, I'd like to organize my thoughts about it in terms of the basic qualities of a gem. I'm not talking here about beauty or rarity, and certainly not flawlessness. Baten Kaitos isn't a flawless game, nor is any other game I've played for that matter. No, what I'm referring to is the categories included in the International Diamond Grading System developed by the Gemological Institute of America to determine the value of diamonds and similar gems, also known as the 4 C's, to wit, color, cut, clarity, and carat. Hey, I warned you in the title that this was going to get literal, so you'd best fasten your seatbelts because it's going to be a rocky ride. Get it? Like diamonds, rocks, you know. Okay, whatever. Let's just start. So the first and most obvious quality of any gem is its color, in terms of both the hue of light that it reflects and the intensity or brilliance of the reflected light. Gems come in many dazzling colors, but if we're talking about a diamond, which is one of the most sought-after gems in existence, the cream of the crop is the totally colorless white diamond. Most so-called white diamonds have tinges of brown or yellow, which come from exposure to other elements besides carbon, so a truly colorless diamond is the rarest and most valuable kind. But the truth is that colorless diamonds aren't really colorless at all. The pure white light that they reflect is composed of all the different colors of light imaginable, and the brilliance that we associate with modern faceted gems is essentially a product of our eyes receiving countless hints of differently colored light as we look at them. That's what gives them their unique appearance, and makes them exciting to look at despite the lack of any obvious color. And that is precisely the kind of emotional range offered by the story and setting of Baten Kaitos. The game doesn't hit incredibly hard on any one particular front, melodrama, philosophy, humor, emotional catharsis, and so on. But it builds up all of these things steadily over the course of the game and weaves them together very intelligently. I remember when Baten Kaitos first came out, a lot of reviewers panned its story for being generic, which is an accusation I never particularly understood. This is a game about people living on islands in the sky, each one of which has a totally unique look and feel, and the only kind of obvious one is the Empire. But even then, Baten Kaitos actually has something to say about imperialism and its consequences. It's a lot closer to Final Fantasy XII than it is to Final Fantasy II. Your party includes a mysterious young girl whose traveling companions get killed half an hour into the game, a sarcastic jerkwad with a mechanical wing on one shoulder and an extra-dimensional guardian angel on the other, an idealistic imperial bureaucrat who fights people with a magic trumpet, and a fisherman. I haven't even discussed the weirdest member of the party yet, and look at these people. This is generic? In what universe? And yet at the same time, I think I can see what made people dismiss this story so easily. It's not that the story is generic, it's that it's subtle. Maybe a little too subtle for its own good. Baten Kaitos gets off to a very slow start, possibly because the player has to learn a pretty unique and unusual combat system, and they wanted to give you plenty of time to get used to it, and possibly just because Masato Kato is kind of a laid-back guy. Actually, one of my favorite things about this game is that it begins in Sidal Sud, a frontier country that's so small and provincial that it doesn't even have a proper government, just a lord who lives in the only real city on the whole island. Not that Firkat is a booming metropolis or anything, it has like 5 streets. It really sells the idea of an island community, more so than any other place in the game. And yet despite being such a humble place, it's also beautiful, a truly bucolic setting in every sense. If Baten Kaitos was just like this for the whole game, I'd still probably love it. It's kind of like the planet Hylis from Beyond Good and Evil, which is where the entire story takes place, and that game is a cult classic. Yet Baten Kaitos does more than this. In fact, every major chapter of the game adds something to it emotionally that puts a new spin on the relationships between characters and makes the plot deeper and more interesting. In Sadal Sud, all you know is that the Empire is evil, they want a bunch of super-powerful magical MacGuffins, Shella is determined to stop them, and Callus just wants to hunt down one particular Imperial officer and pound his face in. But when the party travels to the Cloud Kingdom of Diadem, both the heroes and the villains start to get fleshed out. Diadem is too militarily powerful to be pushed around, so here the Empire has to resort to a full-scale invasion, claiming that the king attacked them first so that other countries will be discouraged from intervening. With the party's help, and Liud's sudden defection from the Imperial ranks, Diadem is just barely able to fend off the assault, but only with considerable loss of life, not to mention that the bad guys succeed in capturing Diadem's End Magnus as well. The entire Diadem section is pretty serious and grim. Not only does it end with Diadem Knights and Imperial soldiers battling to the death, it also begins with the party helping Gibari uncover why there are hardly any fish to catch in the Lesser Celestial River, which shows you that if Diadem defies the Empire, they could easily starve to death. I haven't played many games that effectively convey the harsh, oppressive conditions of a siege. This is one of them. The next chapter of the story takes place in Anue Nue, a pacifist nation protected by a magical shield that can ward off any assault. As a result of this, the Empire has to adopt an entirely different approach here, with the Emperor simply pretending he's visiting the country for pleasure, while his underlings sneak around trying to find the End Magnus without raising too many alarm bells. In Sadal Sud, Lord Rodolfo just went along with the Empire's demands out of fear. Diadem's King Ladekon foresaw the Emperor's evil intentions and chose to fight back, but at great cost. Now we run into a monarch who really doesn't want to pick a fight with the Empire, but who also has enough power to assert herself against them. In both Anue Nue and the next island, Mira, the Empire is forced to employ cunning and diplomacy rather than brute force, and this completely changes the emotional tone of the story. Unlike the grim military overtones of Diadem, Anue Nue is much more calm and cerebral, and sees both the heroes and the villains arguing with each other about what course of action to take. Mira goes even harder on the psychology angle, delving into Callus's dark past, and presenting the player with a mystery involving a stolen End Magnus, as well as some of the most out-there level design I've ever seen in an RPG. Seriously, I know I've already harped on this, but generic? This game where you go to a village made of pastry and fight interdimensional space insects and find a cursed playing card inside a giant mirror maze is generic? Really? The final chapter of the game's first half, technically a little more than half, you change discs before this chapter is over, takes place inside the Empire itself. And I won't get too much into this part of the plot here, except to say that hearing actual Imperial citizens talk about why they think and act the way they do is really interesting. This is another wrinkle on the basic framework of Baten Kaitos' plot, the realization that the bad guys aren't 100% evil, and there are people on their side who probably don't deserve to die in a fire. I think that most good games discuss this at some point, but you'd be surprised how many games are really content to just leave it at, the bad guys are bad, get rid of them. One of the things I really like about Baten Kaitos is that none of the cultures you run into is presented as monolithic, with every resident of an island thinking and behaving the same way. There are conflicts within each island as well as between them, and one of the hardest tasks facing the party throughout the story is just convincing the world's leaders that they need to act. A truly global threat demands a global response, and in the end, even the citizens of the Empire pitch in to destroy the menace that their emperor unleashed upon the world. And as long as we're talking about color, let's wrap this aspect of Baten Kaitos up with a discussion of the game's literal colors, i.e. the visuals. To put it simply, they're beautiful, with some of the most creative and tasteful designs that I've ever seen. Baten Kaitos was made by a lot of the same people who made Chrono Cross, and it's easy to see how their fascination with exotic landscapes, lush foliage, and just environmental detail in general was carried over from that game to this one. I've heard a lot of people talk trash about the voices in this game, but I've never run into anybody who had a bad word for the graphics. In both the literal and the metaphorical sense, Baten Kaitos is a rainbow of colors, but one that's put into a setting that restrains them so that each color complements the others, instead of blazing so intensely that you can't even see them at the same time. And speaking of settings, there's another element of Baten Kaitos' design that's very closely related to how the game tells its story. Gems as they exist in nature typically don't have the brilliant sheen that I mentioned earlier, for one very simple reason: their shape. In order to really shine, a gem has to be cut and faceted in such a way that light will naturally bounce around inside it and radiate back out again. And this always involves a substantial reduction in size. It's not unusual for half of the stone to be chipped away in the process. You can think of this as being like the process that game designers go through when they take all the ideas that the team has generated and cut them down to just the ones that will contribute something substantial to the finished product. If they're too ruthless in editing their own work, the result is a gem that looks puny and unimpressive, however internally consistent and well put together it might be. On the other hand, if they get self-indulgent and leave too much in, the result comes across as dull and unnecessarily heavy. Not to mention people who refuse to cut anything at all and end up with what is essentially an ugly, useless rock. This is a problem that I've always had with sandbox games. Because these are games where the abundance of content is a major selling point and strict gameplay structure is de-emphasized, designers of these games are strongly tempted to leave practically all their ideas in the finished product, no matter how weird or ill-fitting they are. You end up with a mediocre game that lasts 40 hours instead of an interesting one that lasts 15. And while not every open-world game is afflicted by this, it's still way more common a problem than it should be. Now, Baten Kaitos is a turn-based RPG, so it would be expected to last substantially longer than the average game because of the story focus and a certain amount of grinding, which isn't excessive in this case, but you'll probably want to do it at least a little bit unless you really master the combat system. A typical playthrough of Baten Kaitos lasts about 50 to 60 hours, which I would say is right in the middle of the road. It's longer than Chrono Trigger and other RPGs of the mid-1990s, but around the same length as its rough contemporary Final Fantasy X, and considerably shorter than something like Dragon Quest VIII, which does involve an awful lot of grinding, one reason I've never finished that game. But are all of these 50-odd hours equally good? Well, no, not really. I enjoy practically the entire game, but I have to admit there are parts where both the plot and the gameplay sag a little, particularly midway through Anue Anue in the first part of the game, and a few of the major character side quests that take place near the end. Here's the thing, though. I feel this way about practically every game that's longer than 10 hours, particularly RPGs, and the fact doesn't really get in the way of me loving them. Chrono Trigger, for instance, also has a few sections that I don't particularly enjoy, mostly in the future, and Chrono Trigger is considered to be one of the greatest RPGs ever made by most people who've played it, including me. The sheer amount of variety in the game, all of which still fits neatly within the overarching story, makes up for a few tedious moments here and there. If you'll remember, Chrono Trigger was the first game where Masato Kato played a major storytelling role. No, not this. That does not count. And I think it left a pretty strong impression on him that carried over to his later work. Because while their stories are very different, structurally, the plot of Baten Kaitos has a lot in common with Chrono Trigger. Both games start out as a kind of travelogue, in which the protagonist journeys across various themed levels, past and future eras in Chrono Trigger, and islands in Baten Kaitos, each of which features at least one inhabitant, and sometimes more, who ends up joining the party. In Baten Kaitos, the party members aren't always residents of the place where you meet them. For instance, Liud and Savina join the party in Diadem and Anue Anue respectively, even though they're both former Imperial soldiers. But they do always have a strong connection to it. Liud is the Imperial ambassador to Diadem and has a great admiration for it, while Savina has settled down in Anue Anue to build a new life for herself. Then, after 5 of these places are visited, yes, it is 5 in both cases, count them, a world-changing event occurs in which an ancient evil is unsealed, causing the main protagonist to leave the party. Chrono literally dies trying to protect his friends, while with Callus it's a bit more complicated. We'll get to that. The focus then switches to the rest of the party, which manages to pull itself together and ultimately go on a quest to rescue the protagonist. Once this is accomplished, with the additional option of a few party member-based endgame side quests, the party travels to a giant doom fortress floating in the sky and defeats the ancient evil once and for all. These 2 games are hardly the only ones which have used this kind of structure. In fact, it kind of reminds me of the way a lot of classic Zelda games progress, and it's also clearly noticeable in other Squaresoft games throughout the 90s and early 2000s, both Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy X, for instance. But that's not because of a lack of creativity on the part of Monolith Soft. It's because this is a really good way to tell a gripping story. The picaresque nature of the opening chapters allows the player to see a lot of the world early on, and allows exposition to sound more natural and less contrived. For example, you can have characters from different countries explain parts of the same backstory, making it feel like 2 different stories, even though they're about the same thing. It also justifies having a diverse cast of party members, and lets the game designers incorporate them into the story quickly, so that players can get used to working with all the combat tools they're going to have as soon as possible. Here's an example of how Baten Kaitos uses this to its advantage. The Great Mizuti is the last character to join your party, near the end of Mira, the 4th island, and she's also the only one who uses the same kind of attack cards as a previous party member, Shella. This means that the last party member with unique attacks is Savina, who you team up with near the end of Anue Anue, which is less than a third of the way through the game. Before the halfway point, the game is already done introducing new combat techniques, and from that point onward all you have to worry about is the card numbering system, which isn't complicated at all. you get to spend more than half the game actually mastering the combat, instead of just learning how it works, which means that by the end, it feels about as natural as just selecting attacks from a menu in a typical RPG. Don't get me wrong, there are downsides to doing things this way. The Great Mizudi sometimes feels pretty useless, precisely because her attacks are exactly the same as Shella's, and that's a bit of a bummer. But I think the designers of Baten Kaitos realized that sticking with 5 sets of attack cards does so much to simplify the combat that it's worth the possibility of one of the party members being permanently benched. The Great Mizudi is more of a story character than a gameplay character for most people, and that's fine. It's okay for designers to include elements that only enhance the story, and others that are purely gameplay-oriented, as long as these elements don't clash and make each other look ridiculous. For an example of a purely gameplay-related design quirk, at the end of the mirror section, where the Great Mizudi joins your party, you fight a boss called the Phantasm, who has the annoying habit of playing defensive cards which instantly end your turn, so that if you were building toward a combo, you're unable to play the last card and lose the bonus damage. This is something other late-game bosses are also able to do, during both their offensive and defensive phases. And the first time I played Baten Kaitos, I just got mad that the game was cheating by changing the rules on me. But on this latest playthrough, I realized something. This is actually Baten Kaitos' way of making a point about optimal play, and if you're smart about how you adapt to it, these bosses aren't actually difficult, or at least not very. You see, the combat is based primarily on creating 2 types of combo. A straight, where the numbers go sequentially up or down across the board, and a pair, where you have 1 or more groups of same-numbered cards and nothing else. As the game goes on, you're able to play more cards per turn and get better combo bonuses as a result, although you also have to choose your cards more quickly to do so. At the final level, your character can play 9 attack cards per turn and has about 5 seconds to choose each card after the last one is played. So the optimal endgame strategy seems pretty obvious, right? Play 9 cards every turn and just make sure you get a pair combo or a straight. But in fact, as it turns out, this is a terrible way to play Baten Kaitos and will probably get you killed. First of all, you can't get a straight or a pair combo every turn if you play all 9 cards. It's impossible. No amount of clever deck construction or split-second number crunching will let you do this, and if you try, you'll end up with a lot of turns in which you get no bonus at all because you played a single non-matching card. And these are big bonuses we're talking about. A 9-card ascending straight will net you around a 300% bonus, meaning you're effectively doing 4 turns worth of damage in one. But even a 6-card pair combo, let's say 3 2s and 3 1s, gives you around a 40% bonus, which is nothing to sneeze at. If you give up on a double 6-card pair combo to chase after a 9-card straight that you end up failing to achieve, you lose that bonus entirely. And attacking without ever getting a bonus is an almost certain way to lose the harder fights near the end of the game. Playing 9 cards every turn also means you blow through them much faster, and the game penalizes you for running out of cards. You have to take a turn to shuffle them, which you could say is basically a negative 100% damage modifier for whatever you could have done on that turn. As far as I can tell, the actual optimal combat strategy in Baten Kaitos, once you hit that final cap, is to alternate long chains with short ones, only building up toward a long chain if you know that you can cut it off early and still get a bonus. So if you see the numbers 1 through 5 in your hand right off the bat, you can start making an ascending straight, because you know that even if you don't get a 6 the whole time, you can still do a 5-card straight and get a substantial bonus. Plus you keep the other attack cards on hand for upcoming turns. This is the most exciting way to engage with the combat, generally causes you to do more damage, even on turns where you only play 5 or 6 cards, and is conservative enough to keep you from running out of cards when you really need them. And the Phantasm and other bosses like it are designed to push you into playing this way. By cutting off your attacks early, it's telling you that going for the longest attack possible isn't a smart idea. Instead, you should go for smaller combos that it can't block, and which will guarantee you a bonus. It also means that the Great Mizudi, who starts off 1 rank lower than the other characters in terms of how many cards she can use, isn't at much of a disadvantage in this battle. She can't use as many cards, but she does more damage with each because her attack power is higher, which makes her competitive. It's actually really clever and subtle. So subtle that I didn't have the slightest clue what the game was trying to teach me the first time I played it. And you know what? I was still able to beat the game. So even though Baten Kaitos has an intended gameplay style, it never crosses its arms and forces you to play the way it wants in order to have fun. Unlike some games I could mention. Persona. Both gameplay-wise and story-wise, Baten Kaitos is just a very well put-together product. The gameplay and story accommodate each other, each one giving the other enough space to breathe, while also coming in to enhance it at times. There are story moments that hit even harder because they go along with kick-ass boss battles, and combat sections that are more fun because of cards that you get from plot developments. This is a game that's multifaceted, and at every vertex you can see the bright sparkle of a good idea that someone thought to include, contributing to the brilliance of the whole. Okay, so I'm kind of fudging the definition on this one. I said earlier that Baten Kaitos wasn't flawless, and clarity, in the context of gemstones, does literally mean the absence of flaws, or inclusions, that is, small amounts of other minerals trapped inside the crystal structure of the gem. About 80% of the diamonds mined every year have inclusions that are visible to the naked eye, and these are almost always rejected for use as gems. For the rest, there's a scale that runs from slightly included to very slightly included, then very, very slightly included, and no, I am not making these up. Then finally, the insanely rare category of flawless, which means the gem has no inclusions visible to an expert viewing it under 10 times magnification. So you can see that even among jewelers, it's not expected that a flawless diamond will actually be completely devoid of flaws. The important thing is for the flaws to not be obvious, and even then, obvious is a relative term. Slightly included diamonds have flaws which are obvious to an expert, but not to most ordinary people. Some inclusions are even considered desirable because they're visually interesting. The Pink Panther from the movie series of the same name is described as a pink diamond which has a tiny inclusion right in the center shaped like, well, a panther. They didn't come up with that idea out of nowhere. It's based on real gems with rare and sought-after flaws, as weird as that may sound. And this is exactly the kind of practical rating system that I think is appropriate for video games as well. I tend to be a little bit wary of games that receive a 10 out of 10 from review sites, because I always considered 10 to mean perfect. And obviously no game is actually that, or else nobody would ever need to make another one. But if you think of it in diamond terms, this makes a lot more sense. These reviewers aren't really saying, this game is theoretically perfect and could not be better. They're saying, I can't identify any problems with this game, and if it could be better, I don't see how. It's an admission that the reviewer is totally satisfied with the experience in every way he or she can think of. And while most good reviewers try to be at least a little objective, bestowing a perfect score on something is an extremely subjective decision, which, nevertheless, reviewers should be allowed to make. And on that basis, Baten Kaitos is about as close to flawless as any game I've played. It doesn't do everything, but everything it does is done well, and if it does slip up at some point, I could not tell you exactly when that point is. Even the slightly tedious moments I mentioned earlier have their own charms, mostly non-gameplay related. And the moments where the game gets super weird, which in another game I might find insultingly stupid or random, in Baten Kaitos I find really charming and a fun change of pace. And this is where the game's clarity and color come together in a wonderful way. Baten Kaitos is a game with integrity, where all the parts match each other and there's nothing too jarring or out of place. No inclusions, in other words. But it's also a very diverse and colorful game with lots of fresh ideas. Its fictional setting benefits from a long and detailed history, economic and social links between nations that are both realistic and interesting, and a lot of work put into little details that you may not even notice at first glance. In this regard, I'd especially like to point out 3 game-spanning side quests that do a lot to tie the game's various locales and characters together, as well as just being fun to complete. Each one of these side quests is based on something that you'll constantly be running across as you play. Animals, people, and the constellations in the sky. When you travel to the icy country of Wazen, at one point you encounter a woman who asks you to bring her animals from all over the world to take care of, as a kind of zoo. From then on, whenever you run into a new kind of animal, you have the option of picking one up to take it back to her. These include pretty ordinary creatures like ducks, gulls, and caplins, basically goats, but also some really weird hybrid creatures like a bunny cat, a polywhale, a hog rat, and a pow. The pows are my favorite. As the name suggests, they're a cross between a pig and a cow. You can't even start this quest until close to the end of the game, and the reward for getting all the animals is nothing special. But to be honest, walking into a room and hearing 15 different kinds of creature honking, snorting, cackling, and just generally causing a ruckus is its own reward. But even better than collecting animals is collecting animals that you can talk to, i.e. people. In the first city area of the game, for COD, you encounter an old man named Kuzman, who wants to gather his whole family together at his house one last time before he dies. This turns out to be a tad difficult, because Kuzman is a man who's led a long and full life, which included 5 marriages, about half a dozen children, and a whole gaggle of grandchildren scattered across the entire world. And I do mean the entire world. This is one of the first side quests you can start doing in Baten Kaitos, and also very likely the last one you'll finish. I love this side quest. It may be my favorite side quest in any game ever. Finding all these people, who can be identified by the fact that they all wear similar bracelets, is really satisfying, and no two have exactly the same conditions for signing the genealogy Quizman gives you and going back to meet him. It's like being invited to somebody else's family reunion and meeting 50 totally different people in the same evening, hearing about the whole history of the family, the petty politics, and constantly shifting relationships between family members. Which may not actually sound so great now that I think about it, but trust me, it's a stitch. This is a part of the game that's full of humor, melodrama, and pathos, and yet it's 100% optional. It takes guts to put a lot of time into NPC dialogue in a game like this, knowing that lots of players won't even bother talking to NPCs, and I have to applaud the team for doing such a bang-up job. But there's one last side quest to cover, and it takes us from the mundane squabbles of an extended family to the lofty sphere of the stars above. I don't know how familiar you are with astronomy, but Baten Kaitos is actually the name of a star in the whale-shaped constellation Cetus. Promotional materials for the game refer to the star as the belly of the whale. Astronomy was a big inspiration for this game, influencing both its floating island aesthetic and the mystical undertones of its story, and the image of a magical whale swimming through an ocean that disappeared from the Earth long ago is central to its fictional history. This story thread is given a visual incarnation in the form of a giant star map, which covers the ceiling of a celestial church which you teleport to at various times to level up and increase your card class. This map is initially empty, but as you play you run across many of the broken pieces that once filled it with light, and by returning them to an attendant at the church, you can slowly begin to repair what must once have been a breathtaking work of art. I'm not entirely sure what to say about the star map. It has no obvious story significance, and it exists in a part of the game that isn't particularly well defined or explained, but it's just so restful to see it being restored to its former glory one little bit at a time. In a way, I feel like this set piece is about as close to representing the mood Masato Kato was trying to achieve with Baten Kaitos as anything else in it. But we can't spend all day mooning over a bunch of constellations, however soothing they might be. Let's hurry on to the last quality that makes Baten Kaitos special. It's interesting that the quality that usually comes last on the list of the 4 C's used in gem grading is also the simplest and easiest to determine. Its size. A carat is a unit of measurement used almost exclusively for gemstones, now equal to 200 milligrams, but once based on the weight of a carob seed, from which it gets its name. All you have to do to find the carat value of a gem is weigh it, so it's a bit strange for it to come last in the sequence. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that color and clarity, even cut to a certain extent, are qualities that can be determined while the gem is still rough, while you only know how much the finished stone is going to weigh after you're done cutting it down. So in that sense, it really does come in at the end of the process. And I think this goes for fictional stories as well. You can start off with a lot of important, heavy themes that you want to work into, say, a video game, but it's the way you use them that ultimately determines whether the story comes across as deep and meaningful or campy and stupid to the player. If you're careless with how you use profound ideas, they stop being profound. They lose all their weight, so to speak. And you can never tell if a story is going to be good or bad until it's finished, just like a gem. That being said, I think Baten Kaitos in its finished form has a lot of dramatic weight, and it was designed in such a way as to make the most of it. So in this last section, I'm going to spend a little time covering the darker and more philosophical elements in this game's story. But before I do that, it might be just as well to give another spoiler warning. I've already said quite a lot about Baten Kaitos, but up to now the spoilers have been fairly minor for the most part. That is about to change. In order to discuss what really makes this game special to me, I'm going to have to tread all over its story. So if you're intrigued enough for that to matter to you, I would strongly suggest at this point that you pick up a copy of Baten Kaitos and play through it before you watch the rest of this video. Also, I don't want to sound sappy here, but the things I'm about to discuss are pretty emotionally intense and might make you uncomfortable, or even create associations with past trauma in your own life. I don't take the events of this story incredibly personally, but you might. Okay? Here we go then. Baten Kaitos has a fairly large cast of characters, both major and minor, but 3 of them are far more important to the story and its themes than the others. The 2 protagonists, Callus and Shella, and the primary antagonist, Melodia. What's really unusual about this game's story, and one of the reasons why I always shake my head when people call it generic, is that Callus has much more in common, at least at the beginning of the story, with Melodia than he does with his love interest Shella, or with anyone else for that matter. The game begins with a voice, which you can later recognize as Melodia's, telling Callus, "That spirit seems to like you." She's actually referring to the player, who is framed in Baten Kaitos' story as an otherworldly spirit that acts as a kind of guardian angel to the person that it bonds with. Throughout the story, Callus frequently asks for your advice and help, and this is a gameplay dimension as well, with the spirit attacks that randomly pop up during combat sections. The fact that Callus has a guardian spirit is remarked upon by many people as the game goes on, but apparently only Callus and Shella are able to hear its voice directly. Each chapter of the first half of the game also begins with an unseen narrator foretelling the demise of the world, as each of the 5 End Magnus, which she names explicitly, are unsealed. While you never see the speaker, it's pretty clear from her voice that this is also Melodia, which is pretty weird, because when you're introduced to her as a character, she doesn't seem like a bad person. In fact, she's actually kidnapped by the villains, and the party has to rescue her, and later she helps the party sneak into the Empire undetected. She comes across as an ordinary young lady, maybe even a bit of an airhead, not a scheming villain. Emperor Geldoblame is a much more obvious villain, and because you play as Callus, who has a personal vendetta against Geldoblame's underlings after they killed his father and brother on the Emperor's orders, it's really easy to fixate on this angle of the plot, and forget the other little details, which end up being more vital to what ultimately happens. The only character in the party who's strongly motivated from the very beginning to stop the Empire's evil plans is Shella. Callus acts detached and reluctant for most of the story, and is basically dragged along by Shella's insistence and circumstances causing their goals to align. When Callus stops complaining, the game kind of tricks you into forgetting that he doesn't care about the fate of the world, and only wants to destroy Giacomo and his goons. But the truth is that his motivations and his character barely change at all for the first 20 or so hours of the game. You expect character development in an RPG, but what Callus has is like fake character development. He goes along with what the party's doing, he gets stronger, and he even opens up a little bit to Shella at some points. But fundamentally, he's the same revenge-driven, cynical, and bitter misanthrope that he was to start with. And this is an important point, because when you finally reach the climax of the game, when all 5 End Magnus are unsealed and the Emperor draws on their diabolical power, he fails, and you discover that the Emperor was himself being used, tricked, and manipulated the entire time. Melodia steps forward and reveals that no one can actually use the End Magnus. They're too powerful, and their power is tainted by the pain and rage of the dead gods which they're remnants of. Bathing in the light of the End Magnus does in a sense make you super powerful, but it also drives you mad and puts you under their spell, which it's heavily implied has been slowly corrupting Melodia for years up to this point. And this is when she tells the traitor in your party, who everybody suspected may have been present in Mira when one of the End Magnus was stolen, to step forward and receive his reward. And it's Callus. This twist blew people's minds back in 2003, because it's something that stories just aren't supposed to do. The only other story I can think of that reveals the main character to have been the villain all along is Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, a detective novel that was published nearly a century ago. Among video games, this was unheard of, and it's easy to see why. In a video game, the player is a kind of omniscient third person. You see the world from outside, and you're always looking at the main character. How could he possibly do something nefarious without you noticing? Well, the answer is that he tricked you, both in the sense that he deceived his guardian spirit, i.e. you, and wiped your memory with a magical spell so that you wouldn't interfere, and in the sense that he tricks you as a player into believing he's one of the heroes, even though, when you really think about it, he doesn't act like a hero. Just like Dr. Shepard in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, he never tells an outright lie. Instead, he explains himself with half-truths that sound plausible, but leave out all the dirty details. Callus is one of my favorite main characters, actually just one of my favorite characters, period, in any video game, because his actions, while shocking, all fit in logically with his personality and the events of his life. Callus's entire life has been filled with nothing but bitterness. He was born, created actually, with a missing left wing, in a world where almost everyone has two, making him an outcast and an object of pity and ridicule. The only people who ever showed him any affection were his father, Georg, and his younger brother, Fi. And 2 years before the events of Baten Kaitos, Imperial soldiers tracked down Georg, who had defected from the Empire in order to protect Callus and Fi, and burned his house in Mira to the ground, at the same time mercilessly gunning down everyone inside. Callus ultimately lived through that experience, but even he doesn't know how or why, and it's obvious that any kind of optimism he may have had was shattered when he realized that Fi, his brother as well as his only friend, was dead. The fact that he lived while Fi and Georg died doesn't make any sense to him, and the result is that the only thing he now lives for is to take revenge on the people who did it. Underneath the cynical quips and the sarcasm, Callus is an emotional mess, a seething cauldron of grief, self-loathing, nihilistic anger, and survivor's guilt. This is something he shares in common with Melodia, who was saved from an illness that took away both of her parents only by being exposed to the power of an N-Magnus by her uncle, who couldn't stand the pain of losing everyone he loved at once. This restored her to a life that she no longer wanted, a fact which she conceals behind a mask of cheerful innocence, deceiving even her uncle, who knows what she's suffered. This is why she comes up with the idea of unsealing the power of the N-Magnus, and persuades Callus to help her manipulate both Emperor Gelderblame and your own party members into bringing all the N-Magnus together. I have to say, it's really heavy to realize that a game which seems to be about an evil emperor unsealing an ancient magical power so that he can rule the world, which is a pretty generic and well-worn concept, is actually about two broken-hearted teenagers making a suicide pact that involves destroying the entire world out of spite. The resurrection of Malpertio is a metaphor for the malice that Callus and Melodia bear toward the rest of the world. Like them, Malpertio shouldn't really be alive after what he's been through. He's not a natural creature, but a horrible chimera made up of the disembodied parts of long-dead gods. Although the power he draws on is divine, he's not a god, just a creature that seeks death and spreads it everywhere it goes. And this is where Shella comes in. One thing that occurred to me during my most recent playthrough is that Shella is also a lot like Callus, at least in terms of her circumstances. She lost both of her parents at an early age, and keenly felt their absence while she was growing up. And she's young, a year younger than Callus, as a matter of fact. The difference in her case, I think, is the influence of her mentors, and her awareness, which they gave to her, that the world is in danger. It gave her a sense of purpose and a moral grounding that is precisely what Callus and Melodia are lacking in. They're literally demoralized, but she isn't, and that makes a huge difference. So with Callus turning out to be a surprise villain, it's actually Shella who proves to be the true hero of Baten Kaitos, the one who brings the party together and reminds everyone what they're fighting for during the dark times. She's the one who shows a true spirit of leadership when the team is in danger of falling apart. She's the one who's determined to see the best in people, and to never give up, no matter how long the odds are. And this is why she's able to redeem Callus from the darkness he threw himself into. Baten Kaitos doesn't end when Callus betrays the party, bathes in the light of the N-Magnus, and casts you out of his soul. At this point, the game is actually just a little more than half over. As you float about aimlessly, you hear Shella, one of the few people who's been able to recognize your voice, sobbing in an Imperial jail cell. This is the first time that Shella has really broken down like this emotionally. She has good reason to, of course. And you realize that while there isn't anything you can do right now to help Callus, there is something you can do to help her. The Guardian Spirit bonding with Shella is the central turning point that redefines this entire game. It's a little thing to start with, but it snowballs. You bond with Shella and give her some confidence back so she can escape the prison, rescue the other party members, and plan a counter-assault against the forces of Malpertio, which, because this is Shella we're talking about, naturally includes freeing Callus from the spell of the N-Magnus and saving his life. And eventually, despite the overwhelming power of Malpertio and the doubts of other characters, Shella manages to reach Callus and inspire him to shake off Malpertio's influence, an act symbolized by his tearing away the white wings that he was given when he was corrupted by the N-Magnus. Callus is the only character in the game who directly defies Malpertio's control in this way, and he's only able to do it because Shella believed in him. There's a lot of power of friendship stuff in popular culture that comes out of Japan, and I can see why people are cynical about it at this point. But the thing about this is that, first of all, it's really well set up and doesn't involve any plot holes or deus ex machinas, and second, this isn't just friendship here, it's love. And I honestly find that quite inspirational, thank you very much. Baten Kaitos isn't fundamentally just about pain and sorrow. It's also about forgiveness and redemption. If I had to compare its themes directly to another fictional work, the first thing that springs to mind isn't any video game, but rather the animated movie Princess Mononoke, particularly in its stressing the power of empathy, even for those who let their anger rage out of control. Malpertio is defeated in the end not by being beaten to a pulp, but by Callus and a rehabilitated Melodia, long story, I won't get into that here, soothing him and setting him free from the cursed incarnation which they forced him into. It's very Taoist in that sense, and it makes you think. Shadow of the Colossus isn't the only game that puts me into a Zen frame of mind. Baten Kaitos does it too. You know, honestly, at this point, I don't have a lot more to cover. If everything I've said about Baten Kaitos hasn't piqued your interest yet, then I probably don't have what it takes to get you interested in any game. So I'll just reiterate that one of the most striking things about Baten Kaitos to me is that it's a very humble game. It doesn't cram symbolism or moral messages down your throat. It's not above letting you have fun with both its story and its mechanics. It's got a great sense of humor, and it's almost never pretentious. I tend to have a soft spot for more subdued games like this, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles being an example I've covered before, so it shouldn't come as a big surprise that this is one of my favorite RPGs ever. And incidentally, while I've spoiled some of the game's biggest plot twists here, this barely scratches the surface of the mountain of great story details in this game. I've talked a lot about Callus and Shella, but every party member in this game has a character arc, one of the benefits of having just 6 of them, which is something I imagine Masato Kato learned after making Chrono Cross. This isn't just a story about Callus, Shella, and Melodia. It's also about Liud, and Mizudi, and Geldoblame, and Giacomo, and the Fishermen of Nashara, and the Mad Wolf Unit, and the Keepers of the Celestial Tree. And even Trill, she's in this game too. Please don't think that watching this video totally spoils Baten Kaitos, or makes it pointless to actually play it. The actual Baten Kaitos is so much better than my silly video essays can possibly convey, no matter how ungodly long they are. Baten Kaitos is a gem of a game. In its color, it is radiant. In its cut, it is brilliant. In its clarity, it is mostly flawless. And in its Carat, it has a surprising amount of heft. And while I'm a little disappointed that the latest version has taken out the English dub, which I've loved for many years, I have to admit that it doesn't really ruin the story. Nothing could ruin this game's story except leaving out parts of it. It's good enough to be a novel, so don't be afraid to experience it like one. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next year.